verse there, and we'll be talking about Hagar and Ishmael being cast out. If we look back in verses 9 and 10, and we see Ishmael had mocked Isaac, and Sarah had told Abraham to cast out this bondswoman. Now, there's a study in bondswoman, not only to cast her out, but cast her son out also, which was Abraham's first son. And she told him that he wouldn't be an heir with her son. Now, if we look back and view this, she actually gave Hagar to Abraham to be his bondswoman back of this. So over the course of a few years there, she had her disposition had changed, but God still honoring Abraham for what he's fixing to do here and what's fixing to take place. Now, there's a lesson here in Galatians, and I'm going to read it, just to read over that. And it kind of explains a little bit this we're going to be talking about the bondswoman and the free woman. And it starts with the 29th verse in Galatians chapter 4. And it says, "But as then he was born after the flesh, persecuted him that was born after the Spirit. Even so it is now. Nevertheless, what saith the Scripture? Cast out the bondswoman and her son, for the son of the bondswoman shall not be an heir with the son of a free woman." Now, there's a difference in there, and there's a big study in that, and I'm telling you, it's a real study if you ain't studied about these two things here. He says, "So then, brethren, we are not children of bondswoman, but of the free." And he's talking about them that's been born again, saved. We're not children of being bondswoman, so we're not going to be cast out. We're not going to, but we was born out of the free, and we're free. And there's some other scriptures, and I'll go on it a little bit later on. But it speaks about being free. Amen. And I'm glad I'm free this morning. Ain't you? Amen. Glad of being born again. Amen. Most of all, I'm glad God saw my need, and when I called upon Him, He saved my soul. Amen. Aren't you glad of that? But we'll go on now, get into this lesson here, and he starts with the 11th verse, and he says here, "And the things," did I read the other two verses? I didn't, but anyway, we'll go on because we went over them last Sunday. But he says here in the 11th verse, "And the things was very grievous. The thing was very grievous in Abraham's sight because of his son." The thing. What was the thing? The thing was he's going to have to send his son away. This was what his firstborn, he thought a whole lot of him. If we look back, he loved him. I mean, he thought a whole lot of him. And if we look back in the 17th verse there, or 17th chapter and 18th verse, and he said, "And Abraham said unto God, Oh, that Ishmael might live before thee." Oh, he said, oh, he thought a lot of him. He thought so much of him that he thought that he would be the one that would be the seed of him that God had promised him. But we go on here and we see this in verse number 12 here, and he says, "And God said unto Abraham, Let it not be grievous in thy sight because of the lad, and because of thy bondswoman. In all that Sarah hath said unto thee, hearken unto her voice, for in Isaac shall thy seed be called." He is very grievous. He is sorrowful. He was distressed. He loved his son. He loved his second wife. He thought a lot of her. Even though she was, and one of the reasons that she was a bondswoman was she was not of Israel's, I'll say Israel, she was Egyptian. But we go on here and he says, God's answer to the problem. And God's got an answer for every problem that man has. Amen. Sometimes these problems, we'll let them slip in on us and we'll try to handle them on our own. And I'm one of the worst probably to do that is try to do what Ray wants to do, and leave God out. But it's always better to let God work these problems out for us and let Him be in charge of these problems. And sometimes we got some problems so big that He's the only one that can handle them. And I'll testify to that from my life and the things He's done for me. And a lot of times we'll look back and see, well, what can God do for us? But He's saying here, He's just taking this broken heart that Abraham has right now, and He said, Lot, let it not be grievous. The first thing that God does to a man, He comforts him. He gives him a comfort. He lets him know that He's in charge, and that He is able to do that's far beyond man. And he says, don't be grievous because of the lad or because of the woman. And he's talking about the lad's mother, And he's talking about Ishmael here. And he's saying, don't worry about it. He said, I've got it all under control. And what he's telling them here. And he says, and he tells Abraham here, he says, in verse number 12 here, he says, go ahead and hearken unto her voice. Do what Sarah says. Now he's taking this year that's fixing to take place here because do what she says, because Isaac is the true seed of Abraham for the 12 tribes that we're going to see in this. And we've seen the other end of it, and we see how it's fixing to take place. And if we look back in the New Testament, in Matthew, it says there, and it says, Abraham begot Isaac, and Isaac begot Jacob, and Jacob begot Judas and his brothers. Now, Jacob was the father of the 12 tribes of Israel. So that's the genealogy that we can look back through and see where our Lord and Savior come from. And we look back in the seed, and God's got all this planned. God already knew all this prior to this, and He already knew about Jacob. He already knew about Judas and his brothers and the 12 tribes. He knew about all them. And he looks back and he sees here, he's comforting Abraham with all these words. And he says down in the 13th verse, and also of the son of the bondsman will I make a nation, because he is thy seed. All right, he's taken the bondswoman, or Abraham's second wife, and I'll call her his second wife because he took her for, Sarah gave him to him for a wife, and it wasn't the one that he chose, but it was one that she chose. So that verifies the difference between bondwoman and a free woman. A free woman, he had the choice of choosing her, but he didn't choose her. He chose Sarah. So Sarah was the free woman in this here. And we look back and we see that he's going to make a nation out of Ishmael. Excuse me. And if we look back and we see look a little forward here in Genesis, we see in chapter 28, we see where Ishmael has had 12 sons also. So we see that he is going to truly make a nation out of him. Amen. And he's comforting Abraham with these words. So here we got Abraham. He's comforted with these words. And then we go into verse number 14. And this is all fixing to take place. And he says here, and Abraham rose up early in the morning and took bread and a bottle of water and gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder, and the child, and sent her away, and she departed and wandered in the wilderness of Bathsheba. First thing that happens, Abraham, he's probably not slept all night. He's worried about this all night. I know I would. We know through life, and we see things happening. We see our family leaving us, and we wake up, and we never really went to sleep. We've been awake, but we're up. We get up early in the morning. He knows he's going to do what God told him to do, so he takes and gives her some provisions, and he gives her enough provisions to get her where she needs to go. So he takes these provisions. He took the bread, and he took the bottle of water, and they call it bottle of water, but it really wasn't a bottle of water. It was just an old goat skin, probably dried out, and it was made like a sack or a backpack, or however you want to call it. And he drapes it on her shoulder, and she takes the son, and here they go. Now this is, he's about 14, between 14 and 16 years old at this time. His son was, Ishmael. And I tell you what, it'd be pretty hard to know that you're fixing to send your son off at that age. That's a pretty young age for you to send him off. And at that time, he wasn't a grown man by no means. He still had a lot of learning to do. And I don't know what the age was of a full-grown man at that time, but he's still under the training, and then under the training of Abraham. And we're going to talk about that. I'm positive of what's fixing to take place here on a little bit further, and we get into it. And he said, this is going to be hard to do. And he puts it on her shoulder and straps it just like a backpack and sends her away with Ishmael. So what happens? She departed, and she took off a wandering in the wilderness. Now remember, by her being a bondswoman, she was raised up in a house or a tent or wherever the dwelling there, and she never had to do anything on the outside. Everything was done on the inside. And she was Abraham's wife, and Abraham, he was wealthy. He had plenty of substance. Amen. So she really didn't have to go out and get any of this stuff, or hadn't been out any in the wilderness by no means. And here she is. She's taking her son. She's wandering off. And if we look at this, all she's ever done was either worked for Sarah at her young age, and then she became Abraham's second wife, and Abraham took care of her. So she's never had to really take care of herself, but now she's fixing to leave out, and he's saying here, and he says in I believe it says, if I didn't make sure I got the right one here, right page, I flipped 2 pages and about to go too far there, and so she begins to wander here, and we see it only got worse. It's only getting worse. And it says here in verse number 15, and the water was spent in the bottle. It was gone. It was empty. A lot of times in our life, we're empty. And we need a little bit of filling. And we've done used up, seem like all of our resources. We used up everything that we know how to do. And we're just empty. We're an outcast. So what do? We try to protect ourselves and others around us. And that's exactly what Hagar is doing here. And she cast the child under one of the shrubs in the heat of the day. She put him in the shade there. Let me read this next verse. And she went and sat down against him a good ways off, as it were a bow shot from. Now keep this in mind. Wonder why Moses put that in there. There's a reason for that bow shot. For she said, let me not see the death of the child. And she sat over against him and lifted up her voice and wept. There's a whole lot of things happening in this one verse here. The child, Ishmael, he was a teenager. He was dehydrated. He was tired. He was unable to go anywhere. Remember, he had been brought up under Abraham's care. He had been brought up not to work, or everything was given to him pretty much in his life. He was well taken care of, and he didn't have to do anything, hardly to keep it going. But she seen how weak he was, and she puts him under the shade, in the shade under some bushes, and she goes a bow's distance away, a bow shot away. Now I don't know how far a bow shot is, but I'd say it's longer than a football field. But she went back far enough, or where she could almost see him. She could almost see him. She couldn't see him, but she's almost seen him. And then he says, she began to lift up her voice and weep and cry. All hope is gone. She's down to the bottom of the barrel. She don't know what else to do. She's out of water. Her son is over there in the bushes, dehydrated, wore out, unable to do anything else. They're in a desert. They're in a strange place they never had been before. And all hope was gone. It seemed like. And then all of a sudden, verse number 17, and God heard the voice of the lad. But God hears. I don't know how weak he was, or how bad off he was, but I'm sure that he had heard Abraham a-praying to God many times. And he may have just been able to whisper, but I believe the lad was a-praying at that time for his life. And I believe God heard him. He didn't hear the loud voice. He didn't hear the weeping from Hagar, but he heard what? The faint cry of the lad. God's always got his ear open to his people, ain't he? Doesn't that give you hope? Hope is on the way. Help is on the way. And we can see that. All hope was gone. Everything had been cleared up. And God heard the voice of the lad, and the angel of God called out to Hagar out of heaven and said unto her, What aileth thee, Hagar? Fear not, for God hath heard the voice of the lad where he is. What about that? God had done heard all that. And who did he hear first? He didn't hear her. He heard who? He heard the boy, heard the lad. It doesn't say that in here anywhere that the lad was praying or making any sound, but I believe he knew where he was at all the time. God knows where each one of us is at all the time. we're His, and as long as we've got that hope that we're His, He still knows where we're at. And He heard the voice, that small voice, and God hears us even when we cannot speak. And a lot of times, our utterance, and a lot of us is sit down to pray, and we don't even know what to pray for sometimes, do we? And we just have our moanings and the groanings. But God knows exactly what we need. God knows exactly what we're here, why we're here for. But He always gives us that unction. And it ain't long to our utterances that we're not making any sense. All of a sudden it begins to make sense, doesn't it? And the things we start praying for starts opening up. And I believe that. And God hears him because of Abraham. He's got that promise. He's made that promise. And He says there, and He says, the angel of the Lord coming to him, and He says, what aileth thee? She was in pain. And the angel of the Lord come said, what aileth thee? And He says, fear not. And that's some of the best words that you can ever hear at the time you're in trouble, is fear not. I mean, them words right there will ring to you, and you don't have to worry about what's fixing to take place, because He's trying to remove that fear away from you. And He says here, and He says, arise, or the angel says, arise, lift up the lad, hold him in thy hand, for I will make him a great nation. Here goes them comforting words again. He said, I know you sorrows. I know I know what you're going through, but they're saying here, arise, lift up instead of lifting up your voice and crying, lift up the lad and hold to him. Take hold of his hand. And then He says, I will make him a great nation. Them comforting words she give to him. In verse 19, and God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. And she went and filled the bottle with water and gave the lad drink. Sometimes we're blinded by the world, and sometimes we're blinded by our troubles we're going through, and we just can't see the other end of it. And God will have to come by, and He'll open up her eyes. And He opened up her eyes, and what was the first thing she sees? She sees a well of water. Not a whale, but a well of water. So she's had to see the water, and she goes over, and she looks, and she fills the bottle. Did she put a third of the water in the bottle? No. Did you put a half of the bottle? Fill it half full? No. Did it go 3/4? No. She filled it all the way to the top, 100%. And isn't that the way God is when we come through here and we need a blessing? Yes. God comes by, and boy, sometimes it's more than 100%, ain't it? Sometimes it's 110%. Sometimes it's even 200%, I believe. Amen. Sometimes He comes by, and I'm telling you what, I get excited when I know that He's fixing to come by here, and He starts filling us up, don't you? Amen. And He begins it, and He don't do it halfway. But the first thing we see here, after she gets it filled up, and she takes it and gave the lad drink. Boy, isn't that just like getting a blessing from God? You just can't contain it. You've got to give it out to somebody else. So she's got the bottle out here, and she gives it to him, and she fills it up, and she said in here, and she gives that to him, and he says here, and he says, how much can God fill us, And He does. And in Isaiah chapter 40, verse number 28, and I'm going to read a few verses here, and he says, hast thou not known, hast thou not heard, that the everlasting God, the Lord, the creator of the ends of the earth, fainteth not, neither is weary. There is no searching of his understanding. He giveth power to the faint, and to them that have no might, he increases he increases strength. Even the young shall be weary, and the young men shall utterly fall. But they that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings as what? They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint.
Amen.
God's always there, ain't he?
Amen.
Amen. What a blessing to know that he's got it all fixed up for each one of us, isn't he? Verse number 20, and he says here, and God was with the lad, and he grew and dwelled in the wilderness and became an archer. He was a bow shot away and became an archer. What about that? Quite a few years had passed in these verses right here. And he dwelled in he says here, he grew, his home was in the wilderness, and I believe he became an archer to provide for him and his mother. I believe you think about it, here he is out there in the wilderness, and the wilderness ain't like it ain't like growed up. They just ain't nothing there. Bushes ain't probably 2 or 3 foot high, so there ain't many places you can hide in the wilderness. So he became a good archer, and he provided for him and his mother here. And then he says, and he dwelled in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother took him a wife out of the land of Egypt. Exactly where she come from. She knew the people in Egypt, and so she took him a wife there. And the writer, I had something here that the writer wrote here, and I like the way he wrote this, and I wanted to read this to you, and then we'll close at this. But I thank God for him being watching over us. Ain't you? Amen. Even though he can't hear us. There are lessons to be learned from all these involved in this instance. From Sarah, we learned that the lingering consequence of sin can turn us bitter and defensive. We cannot undo what we have done in the past. We can grow in the Lord and see people in different lights and from godly perspectives. From Abraham, we learn that not everything in life is joyous, and sometimes we have to make painful decisions.
Amen.
But we've got to do what God wants us to do. From Hagar, we learn that no matter how drear life is, we are never left to face it without God.
Amen.
We're never, what about that? Amen. I appreciate you. Any comments? I tell you, I hope you're enjoying this study in Genesis, and I tell you, there's so much in this that it just got. It's just the beginning of what the Bible's all about, and I appreciate your prayers and concern. Nothing else. We're dismissed.